Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. For a long time, Americans have liked to imagine ourselves as a nation of debaters. We romanticize the town hall, the courtroom, the constitutional convention, the sharp exchange of ideas. We tell ourselves that democracy depends on argument, that progress comes through disagreement, that the best ideas survive scrutiny and challenge. And yet, if you spend even a few minutes online these days, it doesn't exactly feel like we're living in some golden age of thoughtful civic discourse. Questions get brushed aside, premises get challenged instead of answered. Facts are selectively deployed or outright distorted. Conversations become performances for audiences rather than sincere efforts to persuade or understand. In many cases, people are no longer entering disagreements hoping to refine their thinking. They're entering them to defend identity, score points, or signal allegiance to a tribe, which made a recent New Yorker piece about the intense world of high school debate feel especially fascinating to me. Because on the surface, the article is about competitive debate culture, students speaking at astonishing speeds, dissecting policy arguments, spending weekends in hotel ballrooms arguing about geopolitics and economic theory. But beneath all of that sits a much larger question. If debate is supposedly such a deeply American tradition, why does healthy disagreement feel increasingly rare in American life? And maybe more importantly, why might debate matter even more precisely because of that reality? Now, this topic is also a personal one for me. Both my wife and I spent years involved in competitive speech and debate, both in high school and college. So when I read articles romanticizing debate culture, I recognize both the truth in them and the complications they sometimes overlook. Because competitive debate does teach incredibly valuable skills. It teaches students to research deeply, think critically, organize arguments, anticipate counter-arguments, and defend points under pressure. It forces students to wrestle with perspectives they may not personally agree with. And in an age shaped increasingly by algorithms, misinformation, and AI-generated content, those capacities matter enormously. The people who come from extensive debate backgrounds also sometimes forget how unusual debate culture actually is. Inside debate, there's an implicit social contract. Everyone understands the rules. Everyone enters the exchange voluntarily. Participants understand that hard questioning is expected. Argument itself is not viewed as personal hostility. Aggressive cross-examination and pointed rebuttals are simply part of the activity. The goal is not necessarily harmony. The goal is testing ideas. But that's not how most people experience disagreement in everyday life. In ordinary civic, professional, and relational contexts, disagreement carries emotional weight. Public contradiction can feel humiliating. Criticism can feel like rejection or status threat. Many people do not naturally separate critique of ideas from critique of personhood. And that creates a fascinating tension for people shaped by debate culture. What feels intellectually energizing to a former debater can feel combative to someone else. And after years of competitive forensics, rapid-fire exchanges, and hard questioning can begin to feel normal. You develop a certain numbness to argumentative friction. But outside those environments, many people experience even modest disagreement as emotionally exhausting. And I think that gap explains a lot about modern discourse. Former debaters often approach disagreement as the collaborative stress testing of ideas. Many others experience disagreement as relational conflict. And those are very, very different conversational frameworks. But honestly, I think one of the mistakes we sometimes make is assuming that America's current problem is simply that people, quote, can't debate anymore. I don't think that fully captures it. I think the deeper issue is that we increasingly lack shared expectations for what disagreement itself is supposed to mean. Is disagreement an opportunity for inquiry, a competition, a threat, a performance, a moral referendum, a tribal sorting mechanism? But increasingly, it feels like the answer depends entirely on the environment. And our digital environments have dramatically reshaped those norms. Social media especially rewards entirely different behaviors than traditional debate ethics would suggest. It rewards immediacy over reflection, certainty over nuance, emotional reaction over intellectual curiosity, and viral moments over careful reasoning. The incentives are not built around persuasion. They're built around engagement, and engagement often comes from outrage, conflict, and simplification. And that creates a strange irony. At the very moment when society most needs people capable of thoughtful disagreement, our information systems have increasingly begun the habit of discouraging things that make thoughtful disagreement possible. Because healthy debate actually requires a surprising amount of discipline. It requires listening carefully enough to understand opposing arguments accurately before responding. It requires distinguishing strong evidence from weak evidence. It requires the ability to tolerate ambiguity. It requires emotional regulation. It requires the humility to occasionally admit uncertainty or, and this is shocking, even change your mind. Those are not merely academic skills anymore. They are civic survival skills, especially for young people growing up in a world satirized with AI-generated persuasion, algorithmic filtering, and personalized realities. For decades, education often operated under the assumption that access to information was the primary challenge, but increasingly, I think that challenge is discernment. Students now have near instant access to facts, summaries, arguments, and explanations. AI can generate essays, talking points, and even debate cases within seconds. So what becomes valuable in that world? And I think the answer is judgment. Judgment is the ability to evaluate credibility, to speak to weak reasoning, to synthesize competing perspectives, the ability to ask better questions, and the ability to remain thoughtful instead of reactive. But perhaps most importantly, it's the ability to engage disagreement without immediately collapsing into either hostility or avoidance. That's where I think debate still matters, even if the traditional format sometimes feels antiquated. Not because every student should become a competitive debater, but because the underlying habits of inquiry are becoming increasingly endangered. Now, I think it's also important not to romanticize debate culture too much. Competitive debate does have its own flaws. It can reward performance over wisdom. It can encourage students to treat every issue as strategically arguable rather than morally serious. It can produce incredibly skilled arguers who are not necessarily skilled listeners, and sometimes debate culture overestimates how emotionally detached real human beings can actually be during disagreement. But even with those limitations, there's something deeply valuable about teaching young people that intelligent people can disagree sincerely. Okay, that may sound simple, but it feels increasingly radical in modern culture. Too many environments now condition people to interpret disagreement as ignorance, malice, or moral failure. Debate, at its best, teaches something different. It teaches that understanding opposing viewpoints does not require surrendering your own convictions. It teaches that ideas should be examined rather than merely reacted to. And honestly, that may be one of the most important educational challenges facing us right now. not simply producing students who are informed or students who are high achieving, but producing students capable of intellectual resilience, emotional maturity, and thoughtful engagement in a world increasingly optimized for outrage and certainty. Because healthy democratic discourse requires both rigor and empathy. Too little rigor produces shallow thinking, and too little empathy produces alienation. And modern culture often seems to fail in opposite directions simultaneously. Some spaces discourage disagreement entirely in the name of comfort, and others reward argument completely detached from human consequence. The real challenge is learning how to engage difficult ideas honestly while still preserving dignity, trust, and humanity. And maybe that's the deeper lesson here. Debate matters now not because our society excels at healthy disagreement, but because it increasingly struggles to sustain it. And perhaps one of the responsibilities of schools moving forward is not merely preparing students for careers or college, but helping preserve the habits of thoughtful inquiry and constructive disagreement that democratic culture itself increasingly seems to be losing. A Slice with Dice is a production of AlterCube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.